"Mister, he's touching us again. Let—" The little girl's voice trembled through the phone, thin and terrified. "It hurts so bad down there. Mama's tied up and she's bleeding. She can't help us. Please come." He said nobody's coming for us. "But it hurts too much. We're in the basement, please." Knox Mercer went dead still. His hand tightened around the phone so hard the edges bit into his palm. "Stay on the line," he said, his voice low and lethal. "Do not hang up. Do you hear me?" A small, frightened sound came through. "Please hurry." Knox was already moving. Knox Mercer came back to Chicago 7 years after the woman he loved vanished from his life. The city looked the same from the car window. Gray sky, dirty snow piled along the curb, old buildings standing hard against the wind off the lake. Nothing about it felt warm. Nothing about it felt like home. Chicago had once been the center of his power, but it had also been the place where something in him broke and never healed right. He had left as a younger man with too much anger in his blood and too much grief he did not know how to carry. He returned with more power, more money, and less patience. Time had not softened him. It had sharpened him. Men did not survive at the top of his world by staying open-hearted. They survived by learning what to bury and by making sure no one ever saw where the weak places used to be. That was what Knox had done. He had built his empire bigger overseas. He had made new alliances, crushed threats before they grew teeth, and turned himself into the kind of man nobody approached unless they had a very good reason. He spoke less now. He trusted less. He felt less, at least on the surface. That was how people saw him, and that was how he preferred it. Still, some things never stayed buried. There was a space in him that had never closed. He did not speak of it. He did not even let himself think too long on it. But it was there, quiet and deep, tied to a woman who had disappeared without a word and left him with questions that had rotted into old bitterness. For years he had told himself she had chosen to go. It had been the only explanation that let him keep moving. 2 days after he returned to Chicago, Raymond Mercer sent for him. Raymond was his uncle, his father's younger brother, and one of the few men in the family who had held real power for years without ever sitting at the very top. He managed part of the Mercer money, handled hidden assets, and kept records that never appeared in official books. On paper, the invitation was simple. Raymond wanted to discuss family business, financial accounts, and the future of the empire. The message was clean and formal. Raymond wanted a private meeting at the old house outside the city. There were family matters to discuss, financial records to review, assets to organize, long-term plans for the Mercer empire. On paper, it made sense. Raymond had handled certain accounts and hidden properties for years. He knew where the quiet money moved. He knew which men had been paid to stay loyal and which ones had to be watched. A meeting about business was normal. By the time his car rolled through the gates that afternoon, he was already alert. The house sat far back from the road behind tall iron gates and bare winter trees. It was not just large. It was a grand mansion, built to show wealth, power, and old family pride. Wide stone steps led to a massive entrance framed by tall columns, and long rows of windows stretched across the front like watchful eyes. The lawn was perfectly kept, the circular drive clean, and even in the dead of winter the place looked expensive in a way most people would never touch in their lifetime. But for all its beauty, the mansion felt wrong to Knox. A maid answered the door. She was middle-aged, pale, and too careful. She looked at his tie, his shoulder, the floor, anywhere but his eyes. Then, she stepped back without a word and let him in. The silence inside the house hit him first. Not peace, not calm, silence of another kind. Tight silence. Watched silence. The floors gleamed. The walls smelled faintly of polish and old heat. Every door seemed shut. Every sound seemed muted. Knox paused in the front hall for half a second, just long enough to take it in. There was no music, no television, no ordinary noise from a house that large. Even the staff moved like people who had learned not to make themselves noticeable. Raymond came out of the study wearing a smile that looked practiced. "Knox," Raymond said, stepping forward with a practiced smile. It's good to have you back in Chicago. You've been away too long." Knox took his hand and gave one firm shake. "Thank you for keeping things in order while I was gone. I know you've been overseeing part of the assets, the books, and the family properties." Raymond's smile widened, pleased by the acknowledgement. "Of course, family takes care of family. Your father would have wanted the estate handled carefully, and I made sure nothing slipped through the cracks." Raymond led him into the study. Papers were already spread across the desk. Files had been stacked in neat rows. A drink waited on the sideboard, poured before Knox even asked. That alone told him Raymond had prepared for this meeting with too much care. They sat. Raymond began talking about money, storage properties, shipping routes, and old obligations. He spoke in a calm, easy tone, the kind men used when they wanted to sound harmless. Knox listened, but not only to the words. He watched the man himself. Raymond kept glancing toward the door. Not enough for most people to notice, enough for Knox. His uncle also kept his body too loose, as if he were trying to look relaxed instead of actually being relaxed. There was a difference. Knox had spent years spotting it. Men in his line of work often gave themselves away in the quiet details. A jaw too tight, a hand too still, eyes that moved before the lie did. Knox opened one of the ledgers and flipped through it. The numbers looked clean at first glance, maybe too clean. "How long are you staying?" Raymond asked. "As long as I need to." Raymond leaned back in his chair. "I figured you'd want to get in and out fast. I don't rush when money's involved." A small pause passed between them. Knox held his gaze. "I'm here now. I want a full look at everything. The properties, the accounts, the private holdings, all of it." Raymond let out a small laugh, easy on the surface, careful underneath. "And you will. No one's standing in your way, Knox. But these things are layered. Some of the old arrangements are delicate. A rushed hand can do more harm than good." Knox said nothing. Raymond went on, still sounding smooth and reasonable. "You built your own empire. No one doubts that. But this city, this family, these old assets, they require patience. It's better if I walk you through things step by step, let you ease back in properly." The meeting dragged on. The daylight outside thinned. Knox found small things in the records that bothered him. Nothing big enough yet to call out across the desk. A missing transfer. A date that had been corrected too neatly. The house itself bothered him more with each passing hour. A staff member entered once with coffee and nearly flinched when Raymond looked up. Somewhere overhead, a floorboard creaked, then went quiet too fast. At one point, Knox heard what sounded like a soft thud from deeper in the house, followed by silence so sudden it felt deliberate. When the conversation paused, Knox stood and walked to the back windows. The yard behind the house stretched wide and flat, bordered by a stone wall and a line of bare hedges. Winter had drained the color out of everything. Near the far side of the garden sat an old swing set, paint-chipped, metal dull with age. He might have turned back to the desk. Then he saw movement. Two little girls stood near the swings. They looked about 7 years old, thin, scare. One had dark hair hanging loose down her back. The other wore a faded ribbon near one ear. Neither child ran, neither laughed. They did not move with the careless energy children usually had. They stood close together near the flower beds, heads down, working quietly with small hands. Knox watched as an older woman in a plain grey dress came out from the back door. She walked straight toward them with quick, angry steps. The girls saw her coming and went completely still. "You two useless things," the woman snapped, her voice sharp enough to carry across the garden. "Look at this mess. You were supposed to water the roses properly, not drown the roots. Now half of them are wilting because of your stupidity." The darker-haired girl tried to speak, her voice small. "We're sorry, ma'am. We thought." "Thought? You don't get paid to think." The woman raised her hand and slapped the girl hard across the back of her head. The sound was flat and ugly in the quiet air. "Clean it up right now, and if I see one more mistake, both of you will go without supper again." The second girl flinched but didn't cry out. She dropped to her knees quickly and started pulling at the wet soil with her bare hands, trying to fix what they had done wrong. Her sister joined her right away. shoulders hunched, moving fast so they wouldn't get hit again. They didn't protest. They didn't even look up. They just worked faster, small bodies tense, as if they had learned a long time ago that crying or arguing only made things worse. Knox stood motionless, hands still in his pockets. Knox's eyes narrowed. "Who are they?" he asked without turning. Behind him, Raymond waited a beat too long. Then he said, "Just children." Knox looked back over his shoulder. "Whose children?" Raymond gave a short, easy shrug, though it looked practiced. "They're the maid's children. She had nowhere else to take them, so I allowed them to stay." Knox turned from the window and looked at him fully for the first time in several seconds. "The maid's children," he repeated. Raymond nodded as if there were nothing unusual about it. Temporary arrangement, nothing more. Knox said nothing right away. That answer should have been simple. It should have settled the matter. Instead, it made the whole thing stranger. Because Raymond Mercer was many things, but kind was not one of them. Knox had known that his entire life. His uncle had never been a soft man, never been patient, never been the sort to make room for weakness or inconvenience. He was cold by instinct and ruthless by habit, the kind of man who could destroy a life without losing a minute of sleep, whether the person in his way was young, old, or too helpless to fight back. Mercy had never been part of his nature. Compassion had never been part of his reputation. So no, Knox did not believe for 1 second that Raymond had opened his grand house and his private grounds out of pity for some servant's children. Knox turned back to the window and watched the girls for another long moment. The wind lifted a strand of one child's hair. The other reached for her hand. The gesture was small, but it carried fear in it, real fear. The kind children should never know. A bad feeling moved through him then, slow, sharp, certain. At first, Knox had planned to stay only long enough to review the main accounts and hear whatever version of events Raymond wanted to present. But the longer he remained in the house, the more the two girls began to bother him. It was not just that they were quiet, it was the way they were treated. They appeared only when told. They moved carefully. They never spoke unless spoken to. Their clothes were clean but worn, too plain for a house like this, and no one treated them with the ordinary ease people usually showed children. No one asked if they were cold, hungry, or tired. No one spoke to them like they mattered. Knox started paying closer attention. He learned quickly that the girls did not go to school. No tutor came for them. No driver took them anywhere. No doctor seemed to visit on their behalf. That alone was strange enough, but when he quietly had one of his men check public and private records, the result was worse. The girls did not exist on paper. No birth certificates, no school enrollment, no medical files, nothing. It was as if someone had made sure they were never entered into the world at all. That was no small detail. In his world, invisible children were never an accident. The next evening, Knox brought it up with Raymond over dinner. He kept his tone calm, almost casual. "The girls in the yard," he said. "If they're living under your roof, I want to know who they belong to." Raymond barely looked up from his glass. "I told you, they're the maid's children." Knox let a beat pass. "Then why aren't they in school? Why are there no records for them?" Raymond took his time before answering. "Some situations are complicated. Their mother had problems. I stepped in, that's all." Knox studied him in silence. That answer was too thin, and Raymond knew it. "If those girls carry Mercer blood," Knox said at last, "or if they're yours, then they're not some small private matter. They become a weakness, and weaknesses get used." Raymond's face stayed calm, though something colder moved behind his eyes. "You're looking too hard at something that doesn't concern you. It concerns me if it touches this family." Raymond set down his glass. Not everything has to be dragged into business. That was as close to an admission as Knox was going to get for now, and it settled nothing. If anything, it made the problem worse. Raymond had not denied enough. He had not explained enough. He had only blurred the edges and tried to move on. Knox did not believe him. By the following morning, he changed his plans. He was no longer leaving after a short visit. Instead, He informed Raymond that he would be staying longer to conduct a full review of the financial books, hidden holdings, property records, and private assets Raymond had managed during his absence. Raymond masked his reaction well, but Knox still caught it. A pause, a tightness around the mouth, a flicker of annoyance before the older man smoothed it away. "That seems unnecessary," Raymond said. "You can review the broad structure now and go through the rest gradually." "I prefer complete numbers," Knox replied. Raymond gave a patient smile that did not feel patient at all. "Some of these arrangements go back years. They take time to untangle. Then we'll take the time." What Knox did not say was that the books were no longer his only reason for staying. He already suspected Raymond was hiding more than bad accounting. Missing records, secretive behavior, nervous staff, two girls who lived like shadows inside a mansion too grand for lies that small. It was enough to make him wonder whether his uncle had been skimming money, building something behind the family's back, or preparing for betrayal. Either way, Knox meant to find out. The problem was that the house had been trained not to speak. The servants moved through the halls with careful faces and lowered eyes. Questions went nowhere. Answers came thin, polite, and useless. Nobody knew anything, or at least nobody was willing to know it in front of him. Every door in that place seemed to close a little faster when he came near, and every silence felt chosen. So Knox stopped wasting time on the adults. If Raymond would not tell him the truth, and the staff would not risk it, then the only place left to look was where the lie had begun. The girls. He raised it the next morning in the study as if it were nothing more than a practical matter. "The two girls can help while I'm reviewing the books," he said, turning a page without looking up. "They can sort papers, bring tea, and attend to small errands while I'm here. No sense having them idle." Raymond paused for just a second. It was brief, but not brief enough. "They're children," he said. "They're old enough to carry a tray and stack files." Raymond's mouth tightened, though he smoothed it over quickly. "They're not needed for that," he said. "I can have one of the house staff bring tea and handle the files. There's no reason to drag children into office work." Knox did not look up from the ledger in front of him. "Strange. I was under the impression they were living under your protection. I assumed that meant they were at least trusted to walk from one room to another without causing trouble." Raymond's expression cooled. "That isn't the point." "Then what is the point?" Knox asked, finally lifting his eyes. "You told me they're only the maid's children. If that's true, I don't see why letting them carry a tray or sort papers should concern you so much." Raymond leaned back slightly. "There are plenty of staff in this house. I prefer to use them." Knox gave a faint nod, as if considering that. "Of course. Though from what I've seen, this house is full of people who hear too much, say too little, and look ready to faint every time a door opens. Hardly efficient." A quiet beat passed between them. Then Knox closed the ledger and rested one hand over it. "I'll be here for days, possibly longer. I want the girls in the study while I work. They can sort papers, bring tea, and stay useful. Unless, of course, there's some reason you don't want them near me." Raymond's jaw tightened. Knox held his gaze. "Because if there is, Uncle, that would interest me a great deal more than the books." That landed. For a moment, Raymond said nothing at all. His face stayed controlled, but the look in his eyes turned harder, colder, as if he had heard the threat beneath the polite tone and knew better than to challenge it outright. At last he said, "Fine, if you insist." "It will make things easier," Knox said. Raymond gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "I'm sure that's exactly what it will do." By noon, the girls were brought to the study. They came in together, as they always did, one never far from the other. Luna entered first, though not boldly. She stepped over the threshold like she had learned to measure a room before trusting it. Violet stayed close beside her, smaller in the way some children seem smaller than they really were, not because of size but because of how carefully they carried themselves. Knox looked up from the ledger only once. "You'll help sort these by date," he said, indicating 2 stacks of papers. "Later, you'll bring tea. If you don't understand something, ask." Both girls nodded at once. They did not ask anything. That was the first thing that stayed with him. Most children would have looked confused, or curious, or bored. These two only went quiet and obedient, as if being useful was safer than being young. The work was simple enough, and he did not stand over them. He let them move at their own pace while he continued going through financial records that grew dirtier the deeper he dug. Transfers that should have been clear were muddied. Holdings had been moved through names he did not like. Dates had been altered, not clumsily, but with the confidence of a man used to covering his tracks. Still, more than once, his attention drifted from the papers to the girls across the room. They handled each sheet with care. They barely spoke. When one of them made the smallest mistake, such as setting a page in the wrong pile, she corrected it quickly and glanced toward the door before looking back down. Not toward Knox, toward the door. That told him enough. By the second day, they were less stiff around him, though not by much. Luna spoke first when she had to. Violet watched before moving, as if she preferred to let the world show its hand before she revealed anything of herself. Knox found himself making small allowances without planning to. He had lunch trays sent to the study instead of having them dismissed to the kitchen. He told the maid to bring a second pot of tea because children should not be standing in a cold room all afternoon without something warm. No one argued with him. No one would have dared. And because they were near him now, he began to see more. It started with a handkerchief. Luna kept it tucked in the pocket of her cardigan, folded into a neat square that looked too worn to belong in a house like this. Once, when a page slipped from the desk and she bent to retrieve it, the handkerchief fell to the floor. Knox picked it up before she could. It was old, soft from years of washing, and faintly scented. Jasmine and vanilla. He held it for 1 second too long. That scent hit him in the chest with the force of memory, not loud but deep, the kind that came from somewhere a man had tried hard to seal off. He knew that scent. He knew it better than he knew the cologne he wore, better than he knew the smoke and leather smell of his own world. There had once been evenings when it lived on his shirts, on his hands, on his pillow, and he had never thought he would go long enough without it to miss it like pain. Luna reached for the handkerchief at once. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, careful. Knox gave it back. "Where did you get that?" She froze, just for a breath, but enough. "It's mine," she said. He waited. She lowered her eyes. "I've had it a long time." He did not press, not then. But after she turned away, he sat very still and told himself scent could travel, fabric could be handed down, and memory could be tricked by longing. There were explanations. There had to be. He was not a man who built conclusions out of ghosts. Yet the old ache stayed with him all afternoon. He remembered the woman he had lost in pieces now, because that was how she came back to him, never all at once. A laugh from another time, a hand brushing his wrist, the quiet way she looked at him when she thought he was better than the life around him. No one had ever looked at him like that before, and no one had since. Men feared him. Women desired him, or wanted his name, or liked the danger until they understood what it cost. She had been the only one who made him think, for a little while, that being known might not be the same thing as being judged. He hated himself a little for thinking of her in that house, because memory softened what had happened, and the truth was uglier than memory liked to admit. She had left. She had seen what he was, seen what being close to him meant, and she had gone. Maybe she could not stomach the blood. Maybe she had looked at his name, at his power, at the body count that came with both, and decided she wanted a cleaner life. He had spent years telling himself that was the truth, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was not knowing. Still, the girls were 7. 7 years. It crossed his mind because of course it did, and just as quickly, he pushed it away. A coincidence, nothing more. The world was full of numbers that lined up and meant nothing. A man in his position learned very early not to build his life around sentiment or chance. He was head of the family. He did what the role required. He had made peace, or something close to peace, with the fact that duty came before softness. The things he had done, the decisions he had made, the men he had ordered, buried, or broken, all of it sat on his shoulders whether anyone spoke of it or not. That was the price of leading. It was not pretty, but neither was the world he had inherited. And still, now and then, he wondered what might have happened if he had been born into anything else. Violet pulled him out of that thought late that afternoon. She had been carrying a tray of tea from the side table to his desk when the spoon rattled against the cup. It was a small sound, but she jerked hard at it, as if bracing for impact. Knox stood at once, reached out on instinct, and rested 2 fingers lightly on her shoulder. "It's fine," he said. "You didn't spill anything." The reaction was immediate. Violet flinched so violently it was as if he had struck her instead of touched her. Her whole body recoiled, her eyes widened. Then, just as fast, she dropped her gaze and whispered, "I'm sorry." Knox removed his hand at once. The room went still. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what he should have seen earlier. It was not shyness. It was not simple nervousness. It was fear sharpened into habit, the kind that lived in muscle before it lived in thought. "You don't need to apologize," he said. She nodded, but her fingers still trembled around the tray. Luna moved closer without speaking, not enough to interfere, just enough to stand where her sister could feel she was not alone. That stayed with him too. So did the little things that followed. Violet eating too fast when food was set out, then stopping halfway through as though remembering she should not take too much. Luna scanning the hallway before answering any question that had nothing to do with papers or tea. Both girls going quiet whenever Raymond's footsteps sounded in the distance. On the 4th day, Knox was reviewing property records when Luna spoke without looking up. "Will you be here tomorrow too?" "Probably." She nodded, still sorting pages by date. "That's good." He watched her for a moment. "Why?" The answer came before she could stop it. "Because maybe if you're here, nobody will hurt Mama." The room turned cold around him. Luna's hands went still over the papers. Her face changed at once, not with confusion, with fear. Raw, instant fear, like a child who knew she had said the wrong thing in the wrong place. Violet looked at her sister, then at Knox, and pressed her lips together. Knox kept his voice even. "Who would hurt your mother?" No answer. Luna stared at the desk, as though the grain of the wood might save her. A long second passed, then another. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't mean anything." The words were practiced. He knew that much. He let the silence sit, not because he was done with it, but because pushing too hard now would get him nothing. Children who lived in fear did not open all at once. They offered truth in accidents and took it back the moment they realized it had escaped. That evening, after the girls had been sent out, Knox remained in the study long after dark with the ledgers open and unread in front of him. Mama, not the maid, not a guardian, not some vague woman in the background of the house, their mother. His mind kept circling the same facts. No records, no school, no doctor. Fear in both girls. Raymond lying too quickly. A scent from the past. 7 years where there should have been nothing but absence. He got up and walked the hallway himself. The mansion was quieter at night, though quiet was the wrong word for it. It felt muffled, pressed down, as if the walls held their breath after sundown. He passed the main staircase, the back corridor, the locked room near the old dining hall. On the far side of the house, near the service stairwell, he stopped. There it was, a sound so faint another man might have missed it. Soft crying. Not a child, a woman. Knox stood motionless in the dim light, listening. It came again, thin and broken, somewhere below the floor. Then silence followed, sharp and complete, as if whoever made the sound had learned to swallow pain before it carried. His jaw hardened. When he went back to the study, he poured himself a drink and did not touch it. He thought of the woman he had lost, and for the first time in years the memory of her was not only bitter, it was hungry, restless, painfully alive. He remembered the way she used to reach for him without fear, the way she once believed there was something in him worth saving. No one had replaced her because no one could. He had tried once, maybe twice, to want another woman in any real way, but every effort had died before it began. Some absences did not close. They became part of the structure of a man. By the next afternoon, He knew he was no longer chasing suspicion. He was chasing recognition. It happened when Violet bent over the side table to collect the used cups, and the chain around her neck slipped free from beneath her dress. A small silver ring dropped against her collarbone. Knox saw it, and the world narrowed. "Wait," he said. Violet went still. He crossed the room slowly, though his pulse had begun to pound. "What is that?" Her fingers flew to the chain. She looked frightened at once, not of him exactly, but of the question. "It's mine." He held out his hand. "Let me see it." For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then, with obvious reluctance, she lifted the chain over her head and placed it in his palm. The ring was cool against his skin. Silver, small, a teardrop diamond set in the center. Around the band, carved leaves, fine and exact, maple leaves. A pattern no jeweler would have copied by accident, because he had drawn it himself all those years ago, late at night, with a stupid amount of care for a man like him. He had designed it for one woman only. There had never been another ring like it. His hand closed. He could not breathe right. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and even to his own ears his voice sounded different. Violet looked toward the door, then back at him. "Mama gave it to me." His heart hit hard once, then again. What did she say about it? Violet swallowed. "She said it's the most important thing we have. She said there's only one like it in the whole world." Her fingers twisted in her dress. "She told me to keep it hidden. She said I must never let Raymond see it." Knox stared at the ring in his palm until the room blurred for half a second. Every lie he had been telling himself began to crack. Every easy explanation. Every bitter story he had built over 7 years to make sense of being left behind. The scent, the girls, their age, the crying below the floor, their fear, this ring, not chance, not memory playing tricks, not some servant's children. He looked at Violet, then at Luna standing a few feet away, pale and silent, and something deep and brutal shifted inside him. The past he thought was dead had not died. It had been hidden. And somewhere inside that house, behind the locked doors, under the silence, beneath Raymond's polished manners and his careful delays, there was a truth waiting with teeth in it. Knox closed his hand around the ring and lifted his eyes toward the door. Now he knew, or enough to make knowing the rest only a matter of time. For a moment he stood there without speaking, the small ring cutting into his palm, while Violet watched him with the tense stillness of a child who had learned that one wrong word could bring punishment down fast. Luna had gone quiet in that deeper way. She had, not merely silent, but guarded all the way through. Neither girl moved, neither asked for the ring back. It was as if they felt, without understanding why, that something in the room had changed. Knox did not trust himself to say much, not yet. He placed the chain gently back into Violet's hand and closed her fingers around it. "Keep it hidden," he said. She nodded at once, her face serious, and slipped it back beneath her dress. Then he dismissed them with a calmness he did not feel, and when the study door shut behind them, he stayed where he was and stared at the wood grain on the desk until his own breathing slowed. The house around him seemed farther away than before. The ledgers, the figures, the forged entries, the shell names Raymond had used to move money around, all of it had lost weight in the space of a few minutes. None of it mattered as much now. None of it could. The ring had broken something open. He had designed it 9 years earlier in a way that would have made any sensible man laugh at himself. He had sat up too late one winter night with a pencil in one hand and a drink in the other, sketching a setting that looked simple from a distance but held details only one woman would notice. A teardrop stone, maple leaves cut fine around the band, nothing showy, nothing loud. She had never liked loud things. He had wanted it to feel personal, private, almost secret. He had wanted it to feel like hers before he ever placed it in her hand. And now that ring was hanging around the neck of a frightened child in Raymond Mercer's house. He sat down slowly and leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes for only a moment, and that was all it took. The memory came back clear. Not in broken pieces, not in scattered impressions the way it had for years, but whole enough to hurt properly. He saw her as she had been the first time he noticed her, 19 years old, standing in a crowded gallery space on the near north side with a paper cup in her hand and paint under one fingernail she had missed while washing up. She had not looked like anyone from his world. She had looked too alive for it, too open in some ways, too steady in others. A young woman studying art, talking to someone twice her age without trying to impress them and without shrinking either. He remembered pausing in the doorway, not because he had planned to stay, but because something in the room had shifted the second his eyes landed on her. At 28, Knox had just inherited the Mercer empire in full. His father was gone. The old structure of power had tightened around him before the funeral flowers had even died. Men watched him to see if he would break, if he would overreach, if he would bleed. Rivals pressed from the outside. Opportunists smiled from the inside. Every hour of every day belonged to the family, the business, the alliances, the violence required to keep all three standing. Then, there she was. She had turned when someone said his name, and their eyes had met for the first time across a room that smelled of wine and oil paint and expensive pretense. She had known who he was. Most people in Chicago with good sense did. Yet she had not looked at him with fear or greed or false charm. She had looked at him as if he was simply a man who had walked into the wrong kind of room and did not entirely belong there. That had been the first crack. After that, he found reasons to return to places she might be. At first, he told himself it meant nothing, a passing interest, a brief distraction. He had women available to him whenever he wanted. He had no shortage of company, no shortage of invitation, and no belief that any of it would ever amount to more than appetite and habit. But she did not move toward him like the others did. She did not seem impressed by the Mercer name, and she did not pretend not to know what came with it. She was careful with him in the beginning, but honest. That, more than anything, got under his skin. Their first real conversation had happened outside in the cold after one of her student exhibitions. She had come down the front steps carrying a portfolio bigger than she was, and he had stepped from the shadows before she could pass. "You always leave this late?" he had asked. She had startled, then looked up at him and frowned. "Do you always wait outside like a suspicious man in a movie?" He had almost smiled, which had been unusual enough then that he remembered it still. "Depends who I'm waiting for." She had hugged the portfolio against her chest. "That line probably works on women who don't know better." "It doesn't need to work," he said. "You're still standing here." That earned him a look, half irritated, half amused. And before the night was over, he had walked her to her car and learned she could talk about color and light, the same way some men talked about war, with seriousness, with feeling, with a kind of belief he had forgotten people could have. What began after that stayed hidden for almost 2 years. It had to. He was Knox Mercer. She was a 19-year-old art student with a life that should have remained untouched by men like him. There were enemies who would have used her against him without hesitation. There were people inside his own circle who would have treated her presence as weakness, and weakness in his world was never left alone. So he kept her away from the worst of it, or thought he did. He met her in quiet places, private apartments, a lake house once in the spring, restaurants where the staff knew not to talk. He let only a handful of people know she existed at all. Even then, she changed him more than he liked to admit. She had a gentle way about her, but never a weak one. There was steel in her where it counted. She would look him in the face and tell him when he was being cruel for the sake of control, not because she was reckless, but because she refused to lie to him. Other people softened the truth around him. She did not. Yet she also saw things in him he had stopped believing were still there. She noticed when he was tired, before he said a word. She could tell, just by the way he closed a door, whether he had come from business or blood. And sometimes, when the night was quiet and he had nothing left in him but exhaustion, she would put a hand over his chest and say nothing at all, which did more for him than any speech could have done. She never loved him for what he owned or what he could buy. That was part of what made it dangerous. If she had been dazzled by power, he could have dismissed her. If she had wanted money, he could have kept his distance. But she loved the few softer parts of him that almost nobody ever saw, And because of that, for the first time in his life, he started imagining things he had no right to imagine. A future with windows open in summer, a table set for two, mornings that did not begin with bodyguards and calls from men who spoke only of shipments and leverage. He had not let himself picture those things before her. After her, he had, quietly, stupidly, with more hope than a man like him ought to carry. Still, love did not pull them outside the dark. It only made the dark harder to ignore. She knew what he was, but only in the way civilians know. She understood danger in theory. She understood that his family was not clean. She understood that some men feared him for good reason. But Knox kept certain parts of his life sealed off because he wanted her able to stay beside him without seeing all the blood beneath the floorboards. He told himself he was protecting her. He told himself that if he managed the edges well enough, they might go on as they were. That was the lie. No one loved a man like Knox Mercer and stayed untouched by what followed him. The day everything broke came back to him with terrible ease. It had been raining. He remembered that first. Cold spring rain, steady and ugly, slicking the pavement outside a warehouse on the south end. One of his men had betrayed the family. Not a small betrayal. Not a little theft a warning might correct. The man had sold information that put Mercer roots at risk and nearly got 2 people killed. Worse than that, he had sold it to the wrong people, the kind who would have kept coming until Knox made an example out of him. Knox had handled it himself because sometimes leadership required that. Men followed harder when they saw what happened to treachery. Fear maintained order when loyalty weakened. She had not been supposed to be there. To this day, he did not know whether she had followed him, worried because he had left too abruptly that afternoon, or whether a wrong turn and bad timing had put her in the worst possible place at the worst possible moment. He only knew that when he turned after it was done, after blood had already darkened the warehouse floor and the traitor lay where Knox had put him, she was standing in the open doorway, white-faced and frozen, one hand over her mouth. He could still see her eyes, not just frightened, broken in a way that cut deeper than fear. She had looked at him as if the man she loved and the man before her had split apart so violently that she no longer knew which one had ever been real. He had stepped toward her. She had stepped back. "Don't," she had whispered. That single word had hit harder than gunfire ever had. He had tried to speak, to explain, to tell her this was how his world stayed standing, that men died when they crossed certain lines, that none of it had touched what he felt for her. But explanations sounded rotten in the face of fresh blood. She had turned and fled before he could say enough, and for the first time in years, Knox had followed someone not because he meant to control the next move, but because he was afraid. He found her later that night, shaken and crying, and the distance in her face had done more damage than the shouting would have. She had not screamed at him. That would have been easier. Instead, she had looked at him with sorrow so deep it was almost worse than disgust. "I knew," she had said. "I knew. Your world was dark. I told myself I understood. But I didn't understand that." He had stood there taking it because there was nothing to deny. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. In the days that followed, she drew away from him, not all at once, not cleanly. That would have been easier too. There were silences, broken calls, meetings that ended with both of them hurting and neither able to reach the other. She loved him. He knew she did. He loved her in a way that had already rooted too deep. But fear had entered the room between them and stayed there, and love was no longer the only thing they were carrying. Knox had wanted to pull her back by force of will, by promise, by reason, by whatever he had. Instead, he gave her space, though it nearly tore the skin off him to do it. He told himself she would settle, that she would come back once the shock passed. That what they had built was stronger than one terrible sight. Then she was gone. At first he believed she needed time, a day, 2. Then he went to her apartment and found it empty of her. Some things remained, some did not. He called, nothing. Sent people, nothing. Waited, nothing. And because he did not know then what he knew now, because he had no ring in a child's hand, and no crying beneath Raymond's flaws, and no evidence beyond pain, Knox did what wounded men often do. He told himself the cruelest version because cruelty felt more solid than uncertainty. He told himself she had seen his blood-soaked world and made her choice. That she had left because she could not stand what he was. Because whatever love she had felt had not been enough once she understood the cost. He turned that belief over and over until it hardened into something he could live with, though never well. What he did not know, what no one told him, was that by the time she disappeared from his reach, she had already discovered she was carrying his child. And once he remembered that much, the rest of the past rose up after it. But he didn't know this. She found out she was pregnant 3 days after the warehouse. The test sat on the edge of her bathroom sink while she stood staring at it with both hands braced against the counter, as if the room might tilt and throw her to the floor. Her face in the mirror looked pale and younger than 19, though the last week had aged her in ways no one around her would have understood. Outside, traffic moved as usual. Somewhere down the block, a siren passed and faded. The world kept going. That felt almost insulting. Pregnant. For several seconds, she could not make her mind hold the word. She had spent days shaking under the weight of what she had seen, trying to decide whether love could survive, knowing the full shape of the man she had given her heart to. Then, suddenly, it was no longer just about love, no longer just about fear, no longer just about whether she could stay with Knox Mercer, or whether she had to run from him to save herself. There was a child now, a life, his child. She slid down the cabinet and sat on the bathroom floor with her knees pulled up, crying without much noise because she did not know what else to do. She loved him. That had never stopped being true. Even horrified, even shaken to the core, she loved him. But the image in the warehouse would not leave her either. Blood on concrete, his face set into that cold, merciless mask. The part of him that could decide death and carry it out with his own hands. She had told herself for 2 years that she understood the danger around him. Now she knew she had only been standing at its edge. Yet the pregnancy changed the center of everything. A child deserved truth. A child deserved more than panic and silence. Whatever happened next, she could not vanish without telling him. She could not raise his child, if that was what came to pass, without at least trying to face him once and say the words out loud. So she made her decision, not to disappear, not to end things through absence. She would go to him. She would tell him everything, about the baby, about her fear, about the fact that she still loved him and did not know if that made her foolish or brave. She would let the future break them honestly if it had to. She would not let it rot in silence. She left that afternoon, coat pulled tight, one hand resting unconsciously over her still flat stomach, and never reached him. Raymond Mercer intercepted her halfway there. She knew who he was. Anyone close enough to Knox eventually learned the outlines of the Mercer family, even the branches best avoided. Raymond had always unsettled her, though she had seen him only a few times. He was the kind of man who smiled politely while making the air around him feel colder. Older than Knox, smoother in some ways, softer in voice, but wrong underneath. She had never trusted the way he looked at people, as if he were measuring what could be done with them. His car pulled up near the curb just as she came out of a cab. At first, she thought it was coincidence. Then, the rear door opened. "Miss Sinclair," Raymond said, "I was hoping I'd catch you before you made a mistake." Every instinct in her sharpened. "I'm not interested in talking. I think you should be." She turned to leave. Men stepped out behind her, quiet, efficient, not street thugs, family men. Her heart kicked hard. "Tell Knox I'm coming to see him." Raymond's expression changed very little. That's exactly what must not happen. The next minutes blurred into shock, fear, and hands too strong around her arms. She fought. She was not weak, though she was 19 and alone and small against men, used to following orders without conscience. She bit one of them, kicked another. Raymond watched with flat annoyance until one man twisted her wrists behind her back and another covered her mouth. The last clear thing she saw before being shoved into the car Was the street sliding away from her, ordinary and full of strangers who noticed nothing? Raymond sat across from her as the city gave way to distance. When she demanded to know what he was doing, he waited until the men beside her let her speak. "Saving the family from disaster," he said, "and perhaps saving you from a very stupid belief." "What belief?" "That Knox Mercer is the kind of man who would welcome a child into his life." Her blood ran cold. She had not told anyone. The way Raymond watched her told her he had guessed right. He leaned back, satisfied. There it is. She tried to deny it, but fear had already spoken for her. The rest of the drive became its own form of cruelty. Raymond talked in that measured, almost bored tone of his, the way men speak when they enjoy their own power too much to raise their voices. He told her Knox could never allow a child to exist openly. That, in their world, children were leverage, weakness, bait for enemies. He said Knox understood that better than anyone and would remove any threat before it reached him. He said men like Knox did not build families, they protected empires. If she went to him with this pregnancy, Raymond said, she would not receive love. She would receive a decision. "You don't know him," she said, though even as she spoke the words, terror and doubt were twisting together inside her. Raymond's smile was thin. "My dear, I helped raise him." By the time they reached the house outside the city, he had planted just enough poison to keep fear alive. Not enough for certainty, enough for panic. Enough that every loving memory of Knox now had a shadow beside it. They dragged her through the grand front rooms and down where no grandness reached. The basement smelled of damp cement, stale air, and long neglect. The walls sweated in places. A single narrow window sat too high to matter. A bed had been placed in one corner, though it looked more like an afterthought than mercy. There was a sink, a locked door, no easy way out. When she understood that this was not temporary, not a threat meant only to frighten her, she threw herself at the door so hard she bruised her shoulder. Raymond watched from the threshold. "You'll stay quiet," he said. "If you care at all about that baby, you'll learn quickly." She rushed him then, driven by panic more than strategy. He struck her across the face hard enough to send her reeling back. The room went still. He adjusted his cuff as though nothing much had happened. "Do not test my patience." Then he left, and the lock turned. The first days were the worst because hope had not yet learned its limits. She screamed until her voice broke, pounded on the door, bargained with every god she had never had much use for before. When food came, she refused it until the nausea and dizziness reminded her she was no longer suffering alone. After that, she forced herself to eat for the child's sake. Not because she believed Raymond's lies, not fully, but because fear is a hard thing to untangle once it has been tied to someone you love. He came down often enough to keep that fear fed, sometimes with food, sometimes with taunts, sometimes simply to stand there and repeat, in slightly different words, that Knox would never choose her and never choose the child. He called babies liabilities. He called motherhood weakness. He said she had been foolish to imagine she could step into the Mercer line and come away untouched. He said if Knox had truly meant to build a life with her, she would not have known so little about the life he already lived. It was not just captivity, it was erosion. And above ground in the city she could not reach, Knox knew none of it. He knew only that after seeing him at his worst, Allara had gone and not come back. At first he searched with all the force he had. Apartments, schools, friends, galleries, hospitals. He had men watching airports and bus stations. He sent quiet money to people who could locate almost anyone in Chicago if given enough time. He received nothing worth keeping. No trace, no call, no message, no body. For weeks he lived inside a tight rage that was half fear and half denial. He told almost nobody what she meant to him, but the men closest to him knew enough to keep clear when he walked in. He stopped sleeping properly, stopped eating with any sense. He worked harder, hurt men faster, and drank only when the house was empty because he would not let anyone watch him fall apart. Then time did what time always does. It did not heal. It forced continuation. With no proof of foul play and no sign of her anywhere, Knox began to believe the version that demanded the least vulnerability from him. She had left. She had seen. She had judged. She had walked away because she could not live beside what he was. There was bitterness in that belief, but there was pride too. And pride often makes pain easier to carry than love does. So he took that belief and built armor out of it. He hardened. He stopped waiting. Eventually he left the country for stretches at a time, burying himself in expansion, violence, and work that required no tenderness and offered none back. From the outside, it looked like ambition. Only he knew how much of it was escape. Below ground, Allara counted time by meals, by footsteps overhead, by the slow change in the shape of her own body as the pregnancy advanced. There was no doctor, no mother, no friend, no kindly woman in the corner telling her what was normal and what was not. She learned to listen to herself because she had no choice. She talked to the baby when the dark got too heavy. Sometimes she spoke to Knox too, though only in whispers, because saying his name aloud in that basement made him feel closer and more impossible at once. Months passed. Winter turned and moved on overhead where she could not see it properly. The child inside her grew. Then, later, she learned it was children, twins. The news came not from medical care but from pain, instinct, and the long knowledge of a body carrying more than it had expected. By then, she had no energy left for shock. She had only resolve. Whatever happened, she would keep them alive. That promise became the center of her. When labor came, it came in darkness. No warning worth the name. No one beside her with clean hands and calm instructions. Only pain, sweat, terror, and the fierce animal need to survive because 2 babies were coming, and nobody else in that place would care whether they made it through. She labored on the narrow bed, on the floor, against the wall, losing track of hours and of prayer, and of everything except the work of not dying before they were born. She bit down on a rag to keep from screaming too loudly. She bled. She shook. She thought more than once that she would not live to see morning. But she did. And before the long black stretch of that night ended, she brought 2 daughters into the world with nothing but stubbornness, love, and the last strength left in her body. Luna came first, Violet after. They were tiny, fragile, real. When she first held them, wrapped in whatever cloth she could find, something in her broke and remade itself in the same breath. The basement was still a prison. Raymond was still upstairs. Knox was still somewhere beyond her reach, living inside a lie neither of them could yet escape. None of that changed. But now there were 2 small lives breathing against her, and whatever had been done to her, whatever would come next, she was no longer alone in it. Far from that house, in another city room under another kind of darkness, Knox sat with a drink in his hand and finally let himself believe she was never coming back. That was the cruelest part. She was giving birth to his daughters in a locked basement, while he was teaching himself to live with the idea that the woman he loved had chosen a life without him. There are misunderstandings that can be repaired by time, and then there are those built so carefully by cruelty that they become whole prisons of their own. This was one of those, and while one heart hardened in grief above ground, another kept beating in the dark for 3 lives instead of 1. After the twins were born, Allara no longer lived for herself. She existed only for Luna and Violet. The 2 little girls came into the world in that damp, windowless basement under Raymond's complete control. From the first day, she had to raise them with almost nothing. She scraped together every scrap of food he gave her, often going without so the girls could eat. She endured the cold, the beatings, and the constant fear, all to keep her daughters alive one more day. The basement became their whole world. There was no school, no fresh air, no other people except the occasional guard or Raymond himself. Allara became everything to them: mother, teacher, protector, and the only voice that told them they were not worthless. She whispered stories in the dark, taught them numbers by counting cracks in the concrete wall, and held them close when the fear got too heavy. In that place with no light and no future, the bond between the 3 of them grew deep and desperate. They had only each other to hold on to, so they wouldn't break. Time passed slowly down there. Luna and Violet grew from babies into little girls without ever seeing the outside world. They had no birth certificates, no names in any record, no idea how normal children lived. Everything they knew came from their mother, her quiet words, her tired arms, and the way she tried to keep some humanity alive in a place built on violence and fear. That closeness kept them going. When one cried, the other would crawl over and hold her hand. When Allara was too weak to stand, the girls would bring her the small cup of water Raymond allowed them. They learned early that survival meant staying quiet and staying together. But the hell didn't stop at hunger and darkness. When Luna and Violet turned 6, Raymond changed. He started coming down to the basement more often. His eyes stayed on the girls too long, in a way that made Allara's stomach twist with dread. She knew that look. She had seen it growing for weeks, and every time it appeared, fear rose sharp in her throat. One night he came for Violet first. Allara threw herself between them with everything she had left. She screamed. She clawed at his arms. She begged him to take her instead. She fought like a mother who had nothing left to lose. Raymond laughed at her and beat her until she couldn't stand. He hit her across the face and kicked her in the ribs until she collapsed on the cold concrete, blood filling her mouth. Even then, he dragged Violet away anyway. Allara was tied roughly to the old metal chair, her wrists bound so tight the rope cut into her skin. She strained against the bindings until fresh blood ran down her arms, screaming until her voice cracked. Raymond made sure she could not look away. He wanted her to see what he was doing to her daughter. Violet's small cries filled the basement, first confused, then sharp and broken. The little girl kept looking at her mother with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging Allara to make it stop. Allara screamed until her throat was raw, offering herself, promising anything if he would only leave her child alone. Raymond only smiled and continued, enjoying the power he held over all 3 of them. Luna sat huddled in the corner, hands pressed tightly over her ears, rocking back and forth as if she could disappear into the wall. When it was her turn a few nights later, she went very still. Her eyes became distant, like part of her had already left that basement. She barely made a sound. Allara was forced to watch both of her daughters suffer while she could do nothing but scream and bleed. That helplessness carved something deep and permanent inside her. The guilt was worse than any beating Raymond ever gave her. From that point on, the fear never left the girl's eyes. Violet began waking up screaming in the night, her small body shaking even when no one was touching her. She would curl into a tight ball and refuse to let anyone but her mother near her for days. Luna became quieter, more watchful. She stopped asking questions and started studying every move Raymond made, learning how to survive him as if it was now her only purpose in life. Those nights in the basement broke something in all 3 of them that would never fully heal. The only thing that kept Allara from losing her mind completely was an old burn phone she had managed to hide early on, and a few short voice recordings of Knox. She kept them like treasure. Every night, after the girls finally fell into exhausted sleep and the basement grew its heaviest darkness, she would press play and listen to his voice. It was nothing special, just old messages from better days, but it reminded her that there had once been a life outside this place. A life with warmth and love and hope. She listened until the battery ran low, then hid the phone again before Raymond could find it. 7 years of that. 7 years of trading her body and her sanity so her daughters could live one more day. 7 years of hearing their small voices whisper, "Mama, it hurts," and having no way to make it stop. 7 years of learning that some prisons are not made of walls and bars, but of love and helplessness. There are misunderstandings that can be repaired by time, and then there are those built so carefully by cruelty that they become whole prisons of their own. This was one of those, and while one heart hardened in grief above ground, another kept beating in the dark for 3 lives instead of 1. By the time Knox returned fully to the present, memory was no longer something he visited. It had become evidence. The handkerchief, the scent, the ring, the fear in the girls' bodies, the crying below the floorboards. The locked spaces in a house too polished to be innocent. Every piece had found its place. He did not yet have every answer, but he had enough to know one thing with absolute certainty. Raymond was hiding something far worse than money. That knowledge did not make Knox reckless. If anything, it made him colder. Men like him survived because they knew when rage needed to be leashed. There was a time for violence, and there was a time to tighten the net until the other man began to strangle on his own lies. Knox chose the second path first because he needed Raymond to panic. Panic made men sloppy. Sloppy men revealed doors they meant to keep shut. So the next morning, Knox sat in the study with the books open in front of him and sent for Raymond. His uncle came in with that same controlled face, that same careful ease that had become thinner with every passing day. He had noticed the shift in Knox already. He could not have missed it. The air between them had changed. There was no longer even the pretense that this visit was only about bookkeeping. Knox did not waste time. "I'm expanding the review," he said, tapping a finger once against the open ledger. "Not just the books. I want the private holdings, the unused wings, the storage rooms, the staff records, and every locked space on this property opened." Raymond stopped a few feet from the desk. "That seems excessive, does it? You came to review family accounts, not turn the place upside down." Knox looked up at him. "I came to determine whether Mercer assets have been mishandled, hidden, or used for interests outside the family. At this point, I'm no longer willing to assume the problem is limited to numbers." That landed exactly where he meant it to. A silence passed. Raymond's expression held, but the effort behind it showed now. His face was still composed, though his eyes had gone flatter. "You're accusing me of betrayal?" "I'm saying the records are wrong. I'm saying too many things in this house are hidden. I'm saying I want them brought into the open." Ow. Raymond gave a dry laugh that carried no warmth. "You've been back in Chicago for a matter of days, and already you want to storm through the family holdings like a federal raid. If the books were clean, there'd be no need." Raymond's jaw tightened. "You think running things overseas taught you every detail of how this city works?" Knox leaned back in his chair. "No, but it taught me to notice when a man keeps delaying the moment I'm supposed to trust him." That was the truth of it. Raymond had been stalling since the hour Knox arrived. First the ledgers, then the slow walk through property summaries, then excuses about older arrangements, delicate structures, men who would not react well to sudden change. All of it had been delay wrapped in reason. Knox had let it go only long enough to learn what the delay was protecting. Now he had enough. He rose from the desk. "I'll begin this afternoon." Raymond's face changed then. Not much, but enough. It was the first real crack Knox had seen in him. "That won't be necessary." "It will." I said no. The room went very still. Knox took one step forward. "You don't say no to me on Mercer property, Uncle." The title was respectful on the surface. The tone was not. Raymond's eyes hardened. "You're pushing too hard." Knox held his gaze. "Then stop giving me reasons to." Neither man moved. At length, Raymond looked away first, but not in surrender, more like a man shifting his grip on a knife. "Fine," he said. "You want the whole house looked over? We'll arrange it." Knox saw what sat beneath the words. Not agreement. Calculation. That was exactly what he wanted. Later that afternoon, before the search began, Knox found Luna and Violet in the side hallway near the study. They had been avoiding being alone in open spaces, moving together more than ever, each one glancing toward corners and doorways, as if danger might step out of any of them. When they saw him, both girls stopped. He crouched down to bring himself level with them. "I need you to listen carefully," he said. Luna's eyes fixed on his face at once. Violet stayed half a step behind her sister, fingers twisted in the hem of her sleeve. Knox reached into his coat and took out a small burn phone no bigger than his palm. On its back was a discreet tracking device, one his men used when a job required exact coordinates with no room for error. He kept his hand closed around it for a second before showing it to them. "If something bad happens," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, "you call me with this. Only me." You keep it hidden. You do not show it to anyone. Do you understand? The girls stared at the phone. Luna nodded first. Violet loud a second later. Knox placed it in Luna's hand and closed her fingers over it. Hide it where no one will find it. What if? Luna stopped. Knox waited. Her throat worked before she finished. What if he gets mad? The question sat between them, heavy and terrible, because all three of them knew who she meant. Knox's face did not change, though something inside him went black and sharp. Then you call me. Violet looked up at him wide-eyed. You'll come? There was no softness in Knox Mercer that the world was allowed to see, but something in the way that child asked the question cut through every layer he had built over the years. Yes, he said, I'll come. He did not say more because too much comfort would have sounded like a promise he had not yet earned the right to make. Still, the girls looked at the phone as if it were not a device at all but a narrow door cracked open in a wall that had never moved before. By evening, the search had not even properly begun, and the house was already tightening around itself. Raymond moved through the halls with visible restraint, speaking to staff in clipped tones, sending men to certain corners of the estate, keeping himself informed of where Knox and his people were at every hour. Knox saw it all and let him. He ordered Tristan to keep 2 men by the east stairwell and another at the rear corridor. Nothing overt, nothing that would announce a strike. Just enough pressure to make Raymond feel watched from every direction. That pressure did its work faster than Knox expected. The confrontation came just before dusk in the library. Raymond had been drinking, though not enough yet to slur, just enough to strip the polish off his self-control. He set his glass down too hard on the side table and turned toward Knox with an anger he could no longer hide behind manners. This has gone far enough. Knox did not look up from the document in his hand. Has it? You come into my house, question my staff, rifle through my records, and station your men like I'm some street-level rat working a side hustle. Now, Knox looked at him. If the shoe fits. Raymond gave a harsh laugh. You think because your father left you the crown that makes you infallible? No, Knox said. I think it makes me responsible for cleaning out rot when I find it. The insult hit clean. Raymond stepped closer. You're forgetting who held this family together while you were off building yourself overseas. And you're forgetting who you answer to. The 2 men stood facing each other, family by blood and enemies in every way that mattered. Raymond's face had gone red now, his control slipping by degrees. Knox, by contrast, had become almost frighteningly calm. That was always when he was most dangerous. I know what this is really about, Raymond said. Knox said nothing. Raymond's mouth twisted. Those girls, there it was. A flicker, not a confession, not yet, but enough. Knox's voice dropped. Careful. Raymond's eyes flashed. You've been sniffing around them since the day you got here. And you've been sweating every minute of it. For the first time, Raymond truly looked cornered. Knox saw the panic behind the anger then, and that confirmed more than words ever could. Raymond knew exactly how close the truth had come. He knew Knox no longer believed a single lie about the girls being some servant's children under temporary care. He knew the house could not stay closed much longer. The silence between them turned poisonous. Then Knox said the thing he had held back until that moment. If there's one more lie in this house tied to Mercer blood, I'll tear this property apart room by room until I find it. Raymond's face went white under the flush of anger. For 1 second, Knox thought the older man might actually break. Instead, Raymond smiled. It was not a sane smile. It was the smile of a man whose fear had crossed into something worse. You always were too much like your father, he said softly. Then he walked out. Knox did not follow at once. He signaled Tristan with a look and said only, "Watch him. End." But Raymond moved faster than anyone expected. He went downstairs, down past the polished halls and the thick rugs and the old family portraits, down beyond the respectable heart of the house into the place no visitor was meant to find. By the time Knox realized Raymond had vanished from the visible flow of the estate, The damage had already begun. In the basement, fear arrived before violence. The girls knew his moods by sound. The moment Raymond came down the stairs, Luna went still. Violet pressed close to their mother. Allara rose at once from the edge of the bed and put herself between him and the children. Raymond smelled of liquor and fury. "What did you tell him?" he asked. No one answered. He stepped closer. "What did you say to Knox?" Allara held his gaze. She was thinner than she should have been, paler than any human being should remain after years without sunlight. But there was still something in her that had not bent all the way. "Nothing," she said. He struck her so hard she fell against the wall. The girls screamed. Luna lunged toward her mother, but Raymond caught her by the arm and yanked her back. Violet started crying before she could even form words. The room filled at once with noise, fear, and the old terror they all knew too well. "What did you tell him?" Allara pushed herself up despite the blood at her mouth. "Leave them alone." That only made him angrier. He hit her again, then again, driving the questions at all three of them now. Luna sobbed that they had said nothing. Violet could barely breathe for crying. Allara tried to crawl toward them and got kicked back to the floor. And somewhere inside that storm of panic, Luna remembered the phone. Not because she was brave in some clean storybook way. She was a 7-year-old child, shaking with fear, watching her mother beaten in front of her. But terror sometimes creates its own kind of instinct. Knox had said, "If something bad happened, call me." This was bad. This was worse than bad. This was the thing she had always feared would happen when no one came. While Raymond turned on Allara again, Luna's hand found the little phone where she had hidden it in the torn lining beneath the mattress. She dragged Violet toward the far side of the room, pressed the device between them, and hit the call button with shaking fingers. It rang once. Then, Knox answered. The words came out broken. "Uncle Knox." His whole body locked. Luna tried again, forcing breath into herself. "He's hurting, Mama. He's hurting her real bad. Please come. Please." Behind her, Violet was crying so hard the words tangled. "There's blood. Mama's bleeding. Please, please." Knox was already moving before the call fully ended. Chapter 8. Rescue and Truth. The signal hit his phone at the same moment as Luna's voice. Basement level. Knox did not think. Thinking had already been done. All the cold logic, all the patience, all the controlled tightening of the trap had led to this exact moment, and once it arrived, there was nothing left in him but movement. He turned on his heel and barked Tristan's name so sharply it cut through the whole corridor. Downstairs. Now. Tristan did not ask questions, neither did the men nearest him. They were already running. Knox tore through the back hall, down the service passage, following the map pulsing on the phone screen in his hand. The signal held steady below. Every locked door they hit slowed them only seconds. One was kicked in, another shot through the latch. By the time they reached the hidden stairwell, Knox's pulse had become something savage and mechanical. He no longer looked like a businessman or even a mob boss. He looked like a man reaching the end of 7 years of poison. At the bottom of the stairs, the sound hit first. Crying, then a man shouting. Then, the dull impact of another blow. Knox reached the basement door and found it bolted from the outside. He drew his gun, fired once into the lock, and kicked the rest of it open. What he saw inside nearly drove him mad. She was on the floor. Allara. For a second his mind refused the sight, because the woman on that concrete floor was both the one he had lost and someone almost destroyed beyond recognition by years of suffering. Thin, ghost pale, bruised, blood at her temple and mouth. Her body folded in on itself as if even unconsciousness had not fully released it from fear. The girls were in the corner, clinging to each other. Raymond turned at the sound of the door breaking open, and that was the only reason he lived through the next second, because Knox saw the children first. Violet tore herself loose and ran straight at him with a sob that seemed to rip out of her. Knox caught her against his chest by pure instinct. Luna came only a beat later, not throwing herself at him but grabbing his hand with both of hers so hard it hurt. "Please," she cried. "Please save Mama." The sound of that nearly finished him. Knox handed Violet off to Tristan long enough to cross the room toward Raymond, and every man present knew exactly what they were seeing. This was not anger in the ordinary sense. This was the kind of fury that ends bloodlines. "You," Knox said. "One word." Raymond backed up half a step. "Knox, listen." The first punch dropped him. Knox hauled him up by the front of his shirt and hit him again, then slammed him against the wall so hard the plaster cracked. Men had seen Knox Mercer kill for less than this. They had seen him decide a fate with less cause. If not for Luna's hand still clutching his coat and Violet's crying behind him, Raymond would have died there on the basement floor. Instead, Knox stopped himself at the edge of murder. It cost him visibly. "Take him," he said, voice wrecked with rage. Tristan and two others moved in at once, wrenching Raymond back and pinning him hard. Knox turned away from his uncle as if looking at him any longer might undo the last thread of restraint he had left. Then he dropped to his knees beside Allara. For a second he did not touch her. He looked, really looked, at the bruises, at the hollowness in her cheeks, at the blood on the concrete, at the wrists rubbed raw by old restraints and newer violence. The truth of 7 stolen years lived on her body in ways no story could have prepared him for. "Jesus," he said under his breath. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders and another under her knees, lifting her as carefully as a man might lift something already broken and still precious. She was far too light. That alone told him things he did not want to know. "She needs a hospital," he said. Luna and Violet stayed pressed near him as they moved. Violet would not stop crying. Luna kept looking back toward the basement as if afraid they would be dragged there again if she blinked. Knox gathered them all forward through sheer force of will, one daughter gripping his coat, the other held close at his side while he carried the woman he had spent 7 years loving through bitterness, grief, and ignorance. Upstairs, the grandeur of the house looked sickening. All that polished wood, all those chandeliers, all that wealth sitting above a cage. Outside, the night air hit like a slap. Knox got Allara into the back vehicle himself and pulled the girls in after her. Tristan stayed behind long enough to secure the house and Raymond with it. Knox gave only one order before the doors shut. "No one lets him out of sight." Then they were gone. The drive to the hospital happened too fast and too slowly at the same time. Violet cried until exhaustion took the edge off it and left only small, broken sounds. Luna sat rigid, one hand locked around her mother's sleeve as if letting go would mean losing her. Knox stayed close enough for both children to reach him, though every mile seemed to carve something deeper into him. He had lived beside violence all his life. He had inflicted it, ordered it, used it as the language his world required. But this was not that. This was ruin. Private, hidden, prolonged ruin done under his own bloodline and within reach of his own name. At the hospital, everything became bright lights and controlled urgency. Doctors took Allara immediately. Nurses tried to separate the girls and quickly gave up when it became clear forcing distance would only worsen the panic. Knox used his name, his money, and the visible terror in his face to make sure no one wasted time with procedural nonsense. Specialists were called. Security was placed. Tristan arrived soon after with updates from the estate, but Knox barely heard them. He sat with Luna and Violet in a private waiting room until one nurse coaxed them into warm blankets and juice. Violet eventually curled against his side and fell asleep from pure emotional collapse. Luna fought sleep longer, her eyes swollen and wary, until at last her body gave in too. Knox stayed awake. He stared at the hospital floor and saw the basement. He stared at the wall and saw the ring. He closed his eyes and heard Luna's voice on the phone. "Please come." He had come. But 7 years late, that truth settled on him like a sentence. When Allara woke, it was sometime the next day. Knox went in alone at first because the doctors needed quiet, and because he did not know if seeing him after all these years would heal anything or tear it further open. She looked weak enough to disappear into the sheets. There were bruises everywhere. An IV ran into one arm. Her hair lay pale against the pillow. But she was alive, and when her eyes opened and found him, something painful and stunned moved across her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then tears filled her eyes. Knox crossed the room and stopped at the bedside like a man approaching the one thing in the world he had no right to ask forgiveness from. "I thought you left," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a confession of how wrong he had been. She swallowed hard. "I tried to come back." Those 6 words were enough to break open the rest. The story came out in pieces because pain rarely tells itself cleanly. Raymond intercepting her on the way to him. The threats. The basement. The lies about Knox killing any child that might weaken the family. The years underground. The hunger. The beatings. The girls born there with no doctor, no help, no one. His daughters. Their daughters, Luna and Violet. Raymond's control. The way he used fear like a leash. The way he turned resistance into punishment. When she finally spoke of what he had done to the girls from the age of 6 onward, Knox went so still it frightened even her. He did not interrupt. He did not curse. He did not move at all. That silence was worse than any outburst would have been because it showed exactly how deep the words were cutting. Every sentence struck him like judgment. While he had told himself she abandoned him because she could not bear his world, she had been trapped inside that world by force. While he drank down bitterness and built a colder empire abroad, she had been raising his children in darkness. While he hated her for leaving, she had been listening to the sound of their daughters crying and had no power to make it stop. By the time she finished, Knox had one hand over his mouth and his eyes were wet with a kind of grief he no longer had the strength to hide. "I should have found you," he said. Her tears slipped into her hair. "He made sure you couldn't. I should have found you anyway." That was the part he could not move past. Men had called him ruthless, strategic, unstoppable. Yet the only thing that mattered had been suffering within reach of his own family, and he had not known. He had not saved her. He had not saved the girls. He had let his pride and pain accept a lie because it hurt less than uncertainty. Now the full cost of that lie stood in front of him. His uncle had destroyed the woman he loved and wounded their daughters in ways that would outlast childhood itself. And Knox, for all his power, had spent those same years punishing the wrong ghost. Something in him collapsed under that knowledge, not outwardly in a dramatic way. Knox Mercer did not fall apart with shouting or spectacle. He broke the way stone does under pressure too long, ignored, quietly, irrevocably. He lowered his head to the edge of the hospital bed and wept once, without sound. Then he lifted his face again, and what remained in him was pain, guilt, and a certainty so cold it almost steadied him. Raymond would not escape what he had done. Not through family, not through age, not through pleading, not through blood. No one would, because now Knox knew the truth, and truth in the hands of a man like him was not mercy. It was judgment. After the hospital, Knox brought them all to his own estate. He did not take them there because it was beautiful, though it was. He did not take them there because it carried the Mercer name, though it did. He took them there because it was the one place he could lock down completely, control from the gates to the bedrooms, and make certain no one would come near them without his permission. After 7 years of captivity, fear, and damage done in silence, safety had to become more than a promise. It had to be a structure. It had to be routine. It had to live in walls, staff, schedules, and the simple fact that no door in that house would ever close on them against their will again. He hired the best doctors he could find. He brought in trauma specialists, child therapists, private nurses, and a quiet housekeeper old enough to know when care mattered more than conversation. He gave orders that were simple and absolute. No raised voices, no sudden touches, no questions unless invited. No one entered a room without knocking. No male staff near the girls unless Knox approved it first. Every rule came from the same place in him. That hard and injured part now turned fully toward protection. Even then, the first days were heavy. Rescue had ended the prison, but it had not ended the fear. Fear came with them. It lived in the way Allara woke at the slightest sound, It lived in the girls' eyes whenever a door opened too fast. It lived in the pauses before they ate, as if waiting for someone to tell them the food was not really theirs. It lived in nightmares, in flinches, in silence, in the terrible habit of apologizing for things that needed no apology. Knox learned very quickly that healing was not a straight road and not something money could force into order. Some mornings went almost gently. The girls would sit in the sunroom with blankets and crayons, while a therapist spoke to them in a soft voice they barely answered. Allara would drink tea by the window and simply watch the light move across the floor, as if she still could not believe that daylight was allowed to remain in a room. Knox would keep his distance when distance was needed and come closer only when invited by a look, a question, or one of the girls, quietly drifting toward him without quite meaning to. Other days, everything fractured. A dropped glass would send Violet into tears. A knock at the wrong moment would make Luna back herself into a corner, breathing too fast, eyes sharp with panic. Allara sometimes folded in on herself without warning, not speaking, not crying, just going still in a way that frightened Knox more than visible pain did. On those days he learned not to fix, not to demand, not to speak too quickly. He learned to stay. Sometimes staying was the whole work. Violet opened first. It was not because she hurt less. In some ways, she hurt where everyone could see it. She cried in the night and woke shaking from dreams she could not explain. When the art therapist brought paper and colored pencils, Violet did not draw flowers or houses or lakes. She drew dark rooms, narrow shapes, and stick figures with mouths open in silent cries. Sometimes she pressed the pencil so hard the tip snapped. Then she would look frightened by her own drawing and push it away. Knox never asked her to explain. Instead, he sat nearby when she drew. He read paperwork in the same room, or took calls in a low voice, or simply remained there, one steady adult presence that did not change shape from hour to hour. If she startled when he moved, he slowed down. If she flinched from touch, he gave her space. If she looked toward him in the middle of a crying spell, he held out a glass of water or a tissue and let her choose whether to come closer. Little by little, she did. The first time she fell asleep against his side happened by accident. She had been fighting tears over nothing obvious, just the end of a long, hard day, and she sat on the sofa near him while he read through documents he never really saw. At some point, her head tipped against his arm. Her body went rigid for a second, expecting something bad. When nothing happened, she stayed there. Knox did not move for nearly an hour. After that, Violet began to seek him out in small ways. A question about breakfast, a picture held out for him to see, a quiet request to sit in his office while he worked because the room felt calm. She still cried, still woke from nightmares, still shook when touched unexpectedly, but trust had started to grow inside the damage. One evening, while he was tucking a blanket around her legs in the library after she had fallen asleep over a coloring book, she blinked awake and looked at him with heavy, uncertain eyes. "Dad?" The word nearly broke him. He went very still. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm here." She closed her eyes again, as if that answer settled something deep inside her, and Knox sat there for a long time after, one hand over his mouth, trying to hold together the grief and gratitude of being given something so precious by a child who had every reason not to trust any man at all. Luna took longer. From the beginning, Luna was the watcher. She studied people before she responded to them. She noticed patterns. She did not run into a room because someone smiled. She stood near doors. She listened before speaking. Where Violet's hurt spilled outward, Luna's folded inward and sharpened. She was the one who remembered details, the one who anticipated danger, the one who seemed unable to rest unless she knew where everyone was. Knox understood that kind of mind more than he wanted to. He never pushed her. He did not ask for affection, did not kneel in front of her and demand trust with soft words. Luna would have hated that. Instead, he proved himself the only way she might believe, by being consistent, by showing up every morning, by keeping his voice level, by telling her exactly when he would leave a room and exactly when he would come back, by never entering her space without warning, by making sure promises, even tiny ones, were always kept. If he said he would be back after a meeting, he came back. If he said the night light would stay on, it stayed on. If he said no one would hurt them here, every locked gate, every guard, every careful household rule had to make that statement true. Once, during a storm, thunder shook the windows and Luna dropped to the floor in a panic so fast it made Allara cry just seeing it. Knox did not touch her. He crouched several feet away and said only, "You're safe. I'm staying right here." He stayed through the whole thing, through the shaking and tears and silence afterward, until she finally lifted her head and looked at him, as if measuring whether he had really meant it. He had. Weeks became months. Healing came unevenly, but it came. The house changed with them. More laughter appeared in certain rooms. The girls began asking for foods they liked, instead of eating whatever was put in front of them, as if choice itself were dangerous. Violet started drawing trees. Luna began reading by the window and sometimes forgot to monitor the hallway for whole minutes at a time. Allara slept a little better when the girls slept better. Knox found that most of his life had quietly rearranged itself around 3 people and their safety, and nothing in the Empire felt as important as that. Then one afternoon, while he was helping Luna with a puzzle she had insisted she did not need help with, she fitted the last piece into place and looked up at him with that serious face of hers. "Dad," she said, as if testing the word for strength. Knox looked at her. Luna did not smile. She was not Violet, but something in her eyes had softened. Not all the way, not forever, just enough to show that a door had opened. He nodded once because anything more might have made it too heavy. Yeah, that was all. Yet both of them understood the size of it. While the girls slowly found their way toward safety, Knox and Allara had to find their way back to each other. That happened more quietly than either of them expected. Not through grand speeches, not through trying to pretend the missing years had not happened. It happened in the kitchen late at night when both had come down because sleep would not stay. It happened in hospital follow-up appointments, school planning meetings, therapy briefings, and the 1,000 ordinary moments of caring for children who needed them both. It happened when pain stopped being something each carried alone and became something they learned to sit beside together. There were still tears, still silences, still nights when old grief returned with a force that left them raw. But love, the real kind, proved itself not by surviving untouched, but by returning after being buried. One spring evening, months later, they stood together on the balcony while the house behind them rested in unusual peace. Allara looked out over the garden and said, her voice shaking, "You are home to me. You always were." Knox had carried the ring for 9 years. Even after everything, he had never let it go. He took it out then, got down on one knee beneath the soft evening light, and looked up at the woman he had loved through memory, misunderstanding, and loss. "This time," he said quietly, "there will be no silence between us, no shadows. No one takes you from me again." She cried before she answered, and when she said yes, it sounded less like surprise than truth finally spoken aloud. Their wedding was small. It took place in the garden in spring, with warm light on the grass and pale blossoms drifting through the air. Luna and Violet wore white dresses and carried baskets of flower petals, and though both girls still moved with the carefulness of children who remembered too much, their smiles came more easily now. Allara stood beside Knox in simple elegance, her hand steady in his. There was no need for spectacle. They had already lived through enough darkness to know what mattered. When it was done, Knox drew his wife and daughters into his arms and held them there. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his life, power meant nothing beside that moment. Not the empire, not the money, not the fear his name could still command. Family was the thing that mattered. Family, and the daily work of keeping love alive after pain had tried to bury it. The wounds had not vanished. They would not. But healing had begun, and this time it would not happen in darkness. This time they would do it together. This story ends here. All characters, settings, and events in this story are entirely fictional and are not based on any real-life incident. The purpose of this story is only to build an emotional journey about loss, misunderstanding, pain, redemption, and the healing process of a family after years of darkness. I wrote this story with no harmful intention, and I do not mean to encourage violence, crime, or any wrongful behavior in any way. On the contrary, what I want to highlight is that no matter how deep the darkness may be, sincere love, true protection, and the patience to heal can still open a different path forward. In the end, power, money, and hatred mean nothing compared to family, kindness, and the ability to hold on to one's humanity in the harshest circumstances. The biggest lesson of this story is this: do not let silence, misunderstanding, and pain destroy the most precious things in your life. When you love someone, learn to listen, to trust, and to protect them while there is still time. And after all the suffering, what truly saves a person is not revenge, but the courage to heal and keep moving forward. If you have read all the way to the end, thank you so much for staying with this story. Please leave a like and a comment to share your thoughts and feelings. I would also love to know which character or scene touched you the most. Your support means a great deal to me and gives me the motivation to keep writing more stories in the future.